Chapter 1. Moving in. The sun was just beginning to rise as Willow Marks stepped out of her car, stretching her arms and breathing in the cool, early morning air. The drive to Havenwood had been long, the miles unspooling behind her like a life she was finally ready to leave behind. In front of her stood her new home. A small, charming house with a faded porch, chipped white shutters, and a garden wild with weeds and stray flowers. The house was a little rough around the edges, a far cry from the polished city apartment she'd left, but it felt promising. Here, in this quiet corner of the world, she could finally start over. The yard was quiet, with only the rustle of leaves in the morning breeze and the soft hum of crickets hidden in the tall grass. Willow looked up at the sky, watching as streaks of pink and gold broke across the horizon. This was what she'd craved, a place where time moved slower, where the air felt lighter, and where she could find some peace. She smiled to herself, feeling the weight of the past slowly slipping away. After a moment, she opened the back door of her car, reaching for a cardboard box labeled Essentials in thick black marker. Balancing it on her hip, she carefully closed the door with her foot and made her way up the porch steps, each one creaking slightly under her weight. She fumbled with the key for a moment before the door swung open, revealing the blank canvas of her new life. A living room empty except for the echo of her footsteps, plain white walls that would soon carry her stories, and bare floors waiting for warmth. She set the box down with a sigh of relief, letting her eyes wander over the space. It was small and plain, but it was hers. There was something freeing in the simplicity of it, the sense that she could shape it however she wanted. For a long time, her life had felt like it belonged to everyone else but her. Family, friends, colleagues, all pulling her in directions she hadn't wanted to go. But here, in Havenwood, she was ready to build something real, something of her own. Willow began unpacking, pulling out a few familiar items, a framed photo of her childhood home, a small stack of well-loved books, and a quilt her grandmother had sewn years ago. Each item found its place, slowly turning the empty space into something that felt like home. Hours passed as she worked, her mind drifting back to the life she'd left behind. It was bittersweet, thinking of all the pieces of herself she'd had to let go. But every box she unpacked felt like a small victory, a step closer to reclaiming herself. Eventually, the morning light softened, casting a gentle glow over the room. Willow paused, stretching her sore muscles, and decided she'd earned a break. She poured herself a mug of coffee from the thermos she'd packed, then stepped out onto the porch, savoring the quiet morning. As she looked out over her yard, she noticed movement in the house next door. A tall, rugged-looking man stood in his yard, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her with a look that could only be described as skeptical. He had dark hair that looked like it hadn't seen a brush that morning, and his face was shadowed with stubble. Standing next to him was a small boy, maybe 6 or 7, clinging to the man's leg with wide, curious eyes. Willow felt a smile tug at her lips. She'd always believed in first impressions, and her new neighbor seemed like someone who didn't give those away easily. She lifted her coffee mug in a friendly wave.
Good morning. Moving day. I didn't expect to have an audience.
The man didn't return the smile. Instead, he looked her over with a guarded expression, his eyes dark and steady, as if he were trying to figure out what kind of person had just landed next door. Finally, he gave a short nod, his voice low and gruff.
It's 6:30 in the morning.
Willow chuckled, caught slightly off guard by his bluntness, but she wasn't one to be discouraged so easily. She shrugged, taking another sip of coffee.
Well, I guess I'm an early riser. Can't help it. Too much to do.
The man didn't respond. He simply shifted his weight, his gaze still fixed on her with that same unreadable expression. Next to him, the little boy peeked out from behind his leg, his eyes wide with curiosity as he watched her. Willow gave the boy a friendly wave, hoping to draw him out of his shyness. The boy's grip on his father's leg loosened just a bit, and he managed a small, tentative smile in return. The boy spoke quietly to his father, asking who the new lady was. Willow caught the question, her smile widening as she looked back at the man, waiting for him to introduce himself. But he didn't answer right away. He kept his gaze steady, his expression unreadable, before finally speaking again, his tone cautious.
"Name's Dean, and this is Jamie."
Willow's smile grew warmer. She nodded, her tone light and welcoming.
It's nice to meet you, Dean. And you too, Jamie.
Jamie looked up at his father, as if seeking permission to respond, then gave Willow a small wave, his shyness softened by her friendly tone. Willow set her coffee mug down on the porch railing, looking back at Dean, who still seemed wary. She felt an urge to break through that reserve, to show him that she wasn't here to disrupt his quiet life, just to build a new one for herself.
So, Dean, any tips for a new neighbor? Best places to eat? Where to find the best coffee?
Dean studied her for a moment, his gaze still cautious. He seemed to consider her questions, as if weighing whether he wanted to share anything with this stranger. Finally, he nodded toward the road, his voice steady and flat.
"There's a diner down the street. May's Place. Best pancakes in town."
Willow's eyes brightened, and she gave him an appreciative nod.
May's Place. Got it. I'll have to check it out.
Dean gave a short nod in return, his expression softening just a little. Jamie, still clinging to his leg, looked up at her with that same wide-eyed curiosity, his grip loosening as he warmed up to her presence.
"All right, buddy. Pancakes it is."
Willow felt a warmth spread through her at the sight of the small, quiet exchange between father and son. There was a gentleness in Dean's gaze as he looked down at Jamie, a softness that contradicted his otherwise rough exterior. She sensed that there was more to Dean Ryder than he let on, a depth hidden beneath his guarded expression. As Dean turned to lead Jamie back toward their house, he glanced over his shoulder, giving her a brief nod of acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like a door cracking open, a tiny step toward acceptance. Willow watched them go, a sense of contentment settling over her. She'd been worried about fitting in, about finding her place in this quiet town, but her encounter with Dean and Jamie felt like a small sign that she was on the right path. Havenwood was already beginning to feel like home. With a smile, she finished her coffee and went back inside, her heart a little lighter as she continued unpacking, the memory of her new neighbors lingering in her thoughts. That evening, as Willow was arranging books on the shelves in her small living room, she found herself glancing out the window, her thoughts drifting back to Dean and Jamie. There had been something comforting about their quiet presence, a simplicity that felt refreshing. In the city, life had been a whirlwind of faces and noise, people coming and going without a second glance. But here, in Havenwood, even a brief conversation with her neighbors seemed to carry a certain weight, a feeling that each person mattered. The more she thought about it, the more she looked forward to visiting the diner Dean had mentioned, May's Place. It sounded like the kind of place she could find herself becoming a regular, a spot to unwind and feel part of the community. She made a mental note to stop by the next morning, eager to explore more of what Havenwood had to offer. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over her little house, Willow stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cool evening air. The sky was a soft shade of violet, the first stars beginning to appear. She leaned against the porch railing, feeling a peace she hadn't known in years. Just as she was about to go back inside, she noticed movement in Dean's yard. He was sitting on his porch, his gaze fixed on the sky, a cigarette in his hand. He looked completely at ease, the day's gruffness gone, replaced by a quiet thoughtfulness. Willow watched him for a moment, feeling a strange sense of connection, as if they were both searching for something in the same stars. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Willow felt a jolt, a spark that left her momentarily speechless. Dean held her gaze, his expression unreadable, yet somehow softer, as if he were seeing her in a different light. Finally, he gave a slight nod, his voice carrying across the quiet yard.
Good night.
Good night, Dean.
As he turned and disappeared into his house, Willow lingered on the porch, her heart beating just a little faster. She wasn't sure what it was about Dean Ryder that made her feel this way. This strange mixture of curiosity and warmth. A pull she hadn't felt in a long time. But as she stood there, watching the stars twinkle above, she felt a sense of certainty. This was the right place for her. This quiet town, these guarded neighbors, this little house filled with empty rooms waiting to be filled with her life. For the first time in a long time, Willow felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The next morning, Willow woke with the sun, feeling a rare sense of anticipation. Today, she would explore Havenwood properly, starting with the little diner her neighbor had recommended. She threw on a cozy sweater, grabbed her keys, and made her way down the quiet street. The air was crisp, and the sky was a bright, cloudless blue, a perfect morning to get to know her new town. As she reached the diner, the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon greeted her before she even opened the door. She took a deep breath, savoring the warmth of it, and stepped inside. May's place was everything she'd hoped for. A small, inviting space with checkered tablecloths, an old-fashioned counter lined with stools, and a chalkboard menu displaying the day's specials in cheerful handwriting. It was the kind of place where people seemed to settle in, rather than rush out. A few locals were scattered around, some sipping coffee, others chatting quietly over their breakfasts. Willow felt a rush of gratitude to be here, in this tiny slice of small-town life that felt worlds away from the chaos she'd left behind. She made her way to a booth by the window, taking a seat and gazing out at the quiet street outside. It was still early, and the town seemed to be waking up slowly, easing into the day. She felt a strange sense of peace, the kind she hadn't known in years. A moment later, a woman with silver hair and a warm smile approached her table, carrying a pot of coffee. She was wearing a floral apron over her dress, her eyes twinkling with kindness. Willow knew instantly that this must be May herself. May greeted her with a gentle smile, saying she recognized her from the description Dean had given. New neighbor on Sycamore Lane. She poured Willow a steaming cup of coffee, her voice filled with warmth as she welcomed her to Havenwood. Willow returned the smile, grateful for May's easy kindness. She lifted the coffee to her lips, savoring the rich, dark roast as it filled her with warmth.
Thank you, May. I've only been here a day, but it already feels like home. I think this town is exactly what I needed.
May's smile deepened, her gaze warm and understanding. May told her that Havenwood had a way of doing that, making people feel like they'd been here all along. She leaned in, giving Willow a look that was part curiosity, part knowing. May explained how she'd been running the diner for over 30 years and had seen people come and go. Some leave, but others, well, they're meant to stay. Willow felt her chest tighten with emotion at May's words. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that, to feel that sense of belonging. May refilled her coffee cup without asking, moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before.
Dean said you make the best pancakes in town. I couldn't resist checking them out for myself.
May chuckled, clearly pleased by the compliment. She said that Dean didn't say much about anyone, so the fact that he recommended her pancakes meant something. She set down a menu in front of Willow, suggesting that she try the blueberry pancakes if she was in the mood for something special. Willow glanced over the menu but decided to take May's advice. She ordered a stack of blueberry pancakes, her stomach rumbling in anticipation as May headed back to the kitchen. The sounds of clinking dishes and the sizzle of batter hitting the griddle filled the air, adding to the cozy ambience. As she waited for her food, Willow found herself watching the locals around her, the older couple at the counter, sharing a plate of scrambled eggs, the teenage girl with earbuds in, scrolling on her phone between bites of toast. There was a simplicity to it all, a sense that everyone here knew each other, that they were all a part of something. May returned a few minutes later with a plate stacked high with golden, fluffy pancakes, topped with fresh blueberries, and a generous dollop of whipped cream. She set it down in front of Willow, her eyes twinkling with pride. Willow didn't need any further encouragement. She took her first bite, and the warm, sweet flavor of blueberries burst on her tongue, mingling with the light, buttery pancake in a way that felt almost magical. She let out a small sigh of contentment, nodding at May.
May, these are incredible. I don't think I've ever tasted anything like them.
May chuckled, clearly pleased with the reaction. She told Willow that she had Dean to thank for the recipe, his grandmother's, passed down through the family. Jamie, she added with a proud smile, loved them too. Every Saturday morning, he'd come in with his dad, barely able to sit still as he waited for his pancakes. Willow's smile softened at the mention of Jamie. The little boy had struck her as shy and curious, with a quiet sweetness that reminded her of her younger cousins. She could picture him sitting at the counter, wide-eyed with excitement as May served him his favorite breakfast. Her heart swelled a little at the image. May seemed to catch the look in Willow's eyes, and she leaned against the table, her tone softening. May explained that Jamie didn't have many friends his age, and that Dean, well, he kept to himself. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that it hadn't always been that way. Dean had come to Havenwood a few years back after his wife's passing. Since then, he'd been raising Jamie on his own, trying his best to hold things together. Willow felt a pang of empathy as she listened. She hadn't known Dean's story, but now it made sense. The guarded expression, the reluctance to open up, losing someone, carrying on alone. She could only imagine what that must have been like for him, and for Jamie. May continued, her voice filled with quiet admiration, saying that Dean was a good man. He kept to himself, sure, but he'd done everything he could to make a life for Jamie, to give him stability and love. May glanced at Willow, as if sensing her thoughts. May told her that people here understood Dean's need for privacy. He didn't open up easily, but he was kind, and everyone knew he'd go out of his way to help a neighbor in need. She suggested that if Willow had any questions about Havenwood or needed help settling in, Dean was someone she could count on, even if he seemed a little standoffish. Willow nodded, feeling a newfound respect for her neighbor. Beneath the gruff exterior, she sensed there was a man who had known heartache, who was fiercely protective of his son and wary of letting others too close. It was a sentiment she could understand all too well. As she finished her breakfast, Willow couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her new neighbors than she'd initially realized. Dean's guarded nature wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about protecting Jamie, about building a world where his son could feel safe. And maybe, just maybe, there was a part of him that wanted to reach out, to let someone in, even if he couldn't quite bring himself to do it. May returned to refill her coffee one last time, giving her a knowing smile. May remarked that Havenwood was the kind of town that had a way of bringing people together, even those who were determined to go it alone. She told Willow that if she ever needed anything, a friendly face, a good meal, or just a place to sit for a while, May's place was always open to her. Willow thanked May, feeling a surge of gratitude for the older woman's kindness. It was as if May could see right through her, past the cheerful front she put up, to the part of her that was still healing, still figuring out who she wanted to be. She paid her bill and left a generous tip, then stepped out into the morning sun, her heart feeling a little lighter, her steps a little more certain. May's words echoed in her mind as she walked back toward her house. This town had a way of bringing people together. Maybe, with a bit of time and patience, she could become a part of that, find her own place, her own circle. As she approached her house, she noticed Dean's truck parked in his driveway, the hood up, tools scattered on the ground. Dean was standing beside it, his brows furrowed in concentration as he worked on the engine. Jamie was sitting nearby, playing quietly with a small collection of toy cars, his eyes darting over to Willow as she approached. Willow waved at Jamie, who offered a shy smile in return. She could feel Dean's gaze on her as she walked up, and she stopped at the edge of his driveway, giving him a friendly nod.
Morning, Dean. Looks like you've got your hands full.
Dean straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression still guarded, but slightly softened.
Just a bit of maintenance. Keeps me busy.
Willow nodded, glancing at the truck, then at Jamie, who was watching her with wide, curious eyes. She sensed that he wanted to talk, to say something, but he held back, his gaze flickering between her and his father. Jamie spoke to his father, mentioning how Willow had flowers in her yard, just like the ones he'd seen in the park. Dean listened to his son, a hint of warmth in his eyes as he looked over at her small garden, the bright blooms standing out against the green. Willow smiled, feeling a sense of pride in her modest garden.
Thank you, Jamie. I'll let you in on a secret. I'm still learning. Maybe one day I'll have a garden as nice as the one in the park.
Jamie's eyes lit up, his shyness fading just a little as he listened to her. Dean gave a small nod, a hint of approval in his gaze.
Seems like you're settling in well. Havenwood's good for that.
Willow met his eyes, feeling a flicker of connection, a shared understanding between two people who'd both come here searching for something. She sensed that, like her, Dean had his own reasons for choosing this town, for building a life here.
I think you're right. It feels like home already.
Dean's expression softened, and for a brief moment, she saw a glimmer of something warmer beneath his guarded exterior. A hint of the man May had described, the one who would do anything for his son, and who, perhaps, longed for a connection he was too cautious to pursue. With a quiet nod, Dean turned back to his truck, but there was a subtle shift in the air between them, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something. Willow lingered a moment longer, watching Jamie as he continued playing, then gave them both a wave and made her way back to her own yard. As she opened the door to her house, she felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. She was beginning to understand the town, the people, the rhythms that made this place feel so alive. And in the quiet way of small towns, Willow knew she was slowly, piece by piece, becoming a part of it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Willow sat on her porch, savoring the stillness of the evening. The day had been a good one, a rare, uncomplicated kind of good that filled her with a deep sense of gratitude. She'd been in Havenwood for barely 2 days, yet it felt as though she was finally breathing freely after years of holding her breath. The last traces of daylight faded, and a few stars began to appear, winking softly in the darkening sky. Willow wrapped her sweater tighter around herself, leaning back against the porch railing. The air was cool, tinged with the earthy scent of pine and fresh grass, and the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves filled the quiet. It was peaceful, the kind of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. And as she looked out over her yard, her gaze drifted to the house next door, where she could just make out the faint glow of a porch light. To her surprise, she saw Dean sitting on his porch, a guitar resting on his lap. His silhouette was cast in the soft light, his head slightly bowed, fingers moving slowly over the strings. The melody he played was soft and unhurried, each note lingering in the air before melting into the next. It was a simple tune, almost melancholy, but beautiful in its rawness. Willow found herself captivated, her gaze fixed on him as he played. There was a vulnerability in the music, a tenderness that felt entirely at odds with the gruff man she'd met that morning. It was as though he were speaking through the guitar, each note a glimpse into a part of himself he kept hidden. Without thinking, Willow stepped off her porch and crossed the yard, drawn toward the music. She stopped at the edge of Dean's driveway, not wanting to intrude, but unable to pull herself away. The last note faded, and Dean looked up, noticing her for the first time. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Willow felt a spark, a jolt of connection that left her breathless. He held her gaze, his expression unreadable, and then he spoke, his voice quiet but steady.
Evening.
Evening, Dean. I didn't know you played.
Dean looked down at the guitar, his fingers brushing lightly over the strings as though it were a part of him.
It's just something I do. Helps clear my head.
There was a softness in his voice, a hint of something unspoken. Willow stepped a little closer, her gaze gentle.
Well, it's beautiful. You're really talented.
Dean looked away, his shoulders tensing slightly, as if her words had struck a chord he wasn't quite ready to face.
Thanks.
They stood in silence for a moment, the quiet of the evening settling around them. Willow felt a strange warmth in the stillness, a feeling that went beyond words. She knew what it was to need an escape, to find solace in something that allowed you to feel without having to speak. It was clear to her that Dean's music held a piece of his heart, a part of him he rarely showed to the world. Finally, Dean set the guitar aside, glancing up at the sky. Willow followed his gaze, her eyes tracing the familiar constellations scattered across the night.
You know, I used to look up at the stars all the time when I was a kid. I tried to imagine what it would be like to be up there, floating among them.
Dean's expression softened, and he gave a slight nod, his voice low.
Jamie does that. He loves the stars. Thinks they're magic.
There was a warmth in his tone when he mentioned his son, a tenderness that softened the rough edges of his voice. Willow smiled, her heart swelling at the thought of Jamie's innocent wonder.
Kids have a way of seeing the world like that, don't they? Everything's a little more magical when you're their age.
Dean nodded, his gaze distant, as though he were seeing something beyond the stars.
Yeah. I guess I'm trying to keep some of that magic alive for him.
There was a quiet sadness in his words, a heaviness that Willow recognized. She could see the weight he carried, the responsibility he felt for Jamie, and the quiet determination to give his son a life filled with as much beauty and warmth as he could manage. For all his guardedness, Dean was a man who loved deeply, who cared with a fierceness that was evident in every word he spoke about Jamie. Willow wanted to reach out, to tell him that he didn't have to carry everything alone, but she sensed that he wasn't ready to let anyone in, not yet. Instead, she simply stood there beside him, sharing the silence, letting him know she was there. After a moment, Dean turned back to her, his gaze steady but softer than before.
Havenwood's different from where you came from, isn't it?
Very different, in a good way.
Dean gave a slight nod, a hint of understanding in his eyes.
Why'd you come here?
Willow hesitated, the question catching her off guard. She hadn't expected to share her reasons with anyone, let alone her guarded neighbor. But something about the quiet night, the gentle strumming of the guitar that still echoed in her mind, made her feel safe enough to be honest.
I needed a fresh start. Life got too loud, too heavy. I thought maybe a place like this could help me find myself again.
Dean watched her for a moment, his gaze steady, as though he were searching for something in her words. She saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a quiet understanding that told her he knew exactly what she meant.
Havenwood's good for that. People here, they give you space to figure things out, but they don't let you disappear either.
Willow nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle over her. This town had a way of embracing people without suffocating them, of letting them find their own way while gently reminding them they weren't alone. They fell into another comfortable silence, each lost in their thoughts. Willow glanced over at Dean, noting the lines of weariness etched into his face, the shadows in his eyes that hinted at a story untold. She realized that, like her, Dean was a person who had come to Havenwood seeking something, a sense of peace, a place to belong. And in his own quiet way, he was rebuilding his life, piece by piece, with Jamie at the center of it all.
If you ever need anything, you know where to find me. I'm pretty good at keeping secrets, if that helps.
Dean looked at her, his expression unreadable. But there was a softness in his eyes, a flicker of something that looked almost like gratitude.
Thanks, Willow. I'll keep that in mind.
He stood, picking up his guitar, and gave her one last nod before heading inside. As he disappeared into the house, Willow remained on the porch, staring up at the stars, her heart a little lighter, her thoughts a little clearer. That night, as she lay in bed, Willow replayed their conversation in her mind, the quiet moments that had passed between them like unspoken promises. She knew that Dean Ryder was a man with walls built high, but she also knew that beneath those walls was a kind heart, a fierce love for his son, and a vulnerability he kept hidden. And for the first time since arriving in Havenwood, Willow felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for the life she could build here, in this quiet town, with these complicated, wonderful people. Thank you for joining us in Chapter 1 of Heartstrings and Healing. If you enjoyed listening, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated on Willow's journey in Havenwood. Your support helps us bring each chapter to life. And stay tuned for Chapter 2, where Willow's connection with Dean grows deeper, and she finds herself drawn into the rhythms of small-town life. New friendships, hidden pasts, and heartfelt moments await. We can't wait to share it with you. See you in the next chapter.